The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin, Jeong. Nepal is living through one of its most dramatic political shakeups in years. After days of violent protests led mostly by Gen Z activists, Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli was forced to step down. Parliament has been dissolved, dozens have been killed, and the capital, Kathmandu, is still under curfew. Protesters themselves have nominated Sushila Karki, Nepal's first female Chief Justice, to take charge as interim leader. So what happens now? Is Nepal at the start of a new political era shaped by its relentless youth? Or is this just another fragile stopgap in a country with a history of turmoil? Well, joining us to share more is Dr. D.B. Subedi, who is the lecturer in Peace and Conflict Studies at the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. Hi, Dr. Subedi. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, Doctor, Nepal has just seen the resignation of KP Sharma Oli after days of deadly protests here. Now, these protests were led by Gen Z. So for some context for our listeners, what had fueled these protests and how severe did it get for such protests to have, forced the prime minister out of office?
Yeah, on the 4th of September, the coalition government led by Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli actually banned almost 26 social media platforms in Nepal. And the reason government gave to the people was that these social media platforms, including Facebook, TikTok, and many others, refused to register with the government authorities in Kathmandu. And this actually angered the people at large, but especially the young people, the younger generations, what we also know as Generation G. And these people started showing the angers, but then the generation which was actually living with internet, the social media being part of their everyday cultures was banned, and that actually provoked the younger generation and triggered the frustrations of the people. But actually, the banning of social media in Nepal was just a trigger factor because there is a much more larger structural, institutional, and systemic issues that many people, including young generations, was not happy about. And especially the younger generations has seen the worst political instability in the country. They have experienced growing inequalities in the country. They have seen inequalities in many forms, for example, children of politicians and political leaders living lavish lifestyles, which was circulated in the social media. But at the same time, along with political instability, there is joblessness in Nepal. Thousands of young people are leaving country abroad for jobs. So as a result of that, people were really frustrated about the government, how the government was, ruling the country. So this ban on social media actually worked as a trigger factor. And then the younger generation, especially Gen Z, called for a protest movement. And that's how they came to the street. On 7th September, thousands of people took to the street protesting against the government, mostly, against the banning of the social media platform, but also demanding the resignation of the government because failed to address the basic needs of the people, And the government, actually, the police responded with the use of force. In fact, disproportionate use of force. On the very first day, there were about 17 people killed and many hundreds were injured. And the amount of force used to contain the protest was actually, it attracted criticism both nationally and internationally. And, the death of protesters on a day one even further angered the protesters. And many other people then started supporting the protesters. So they actually came back to the protests the next day as well. And on the second day, the protest went very, very violent. There were many government buildings, including the Central Business Complex, Parliament, and many other government buildings were set on fire. Politicians' residence were set on fire. Even the private property and public property were vandalized, and the situation almost went out of control. And amidst this unfolding chaos, Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli resigned from his post. And actually, many other ministers also resigned on that day.
So how significant is that young people, rather than, traditional political parties, were the driving force behind this transition?
Indeed, it is very significant, because this is not the first time when Nepal has seen political protests on the street leading to some kind of significant political changes. For example, in the 1990s, there were big political protests. In fact, a big public uprising which actually change brought about a massive shift in the political system. Because in 1990, if you remember, following the People's Uprising, before 1990 was, ruled by absolute monarchy, changed to a constitutional monarchy. So that was a massive and, in fact, historic political shift. Likewise, in 2006, there was another huge public uprising, what is also known as Jana Andolan 2, meaning people's protest, people's uprising 2 in 2006, which also brought about massive change because it actually ended the monarchy, the constitutional monarchical system, and paved the way for a new political system, which is currently placed. And this is now, the system is federal republic system. So you can see in the past, there have been significant protest movements bringing about political changes. But this one is very significant, because it is entirely mostly led by young people, especially Generation Z people. This was, to a certain extent, you could also say this was a leaderless, in the sense that there was not one particular leader who was actually leading the whole protest. It was spontaneous participation of young people. And interestingly, because this is the age of internet, this is the age of digital culture and social media, these younger generations actually mobilized people through, social media, especially Viber, because that was not banned, while 26 other platforms were banned at that time. On the very first, when the government actually lifted the social media ban on the first day, then people started mobilizing social media again, in this kind of protest. So this is very significant in the sense that there was no direct involvement of any political parties in people in the street. It was, in a way, leaderless, and there was significant mobilization of internet and social media platforms to organize this protest. It was different than the previous people's uprising and protest in the history of Nepal.
Right. Well, now in his place, Sushila Karki, a former Chief Justice and the first woman to become Prime Minister, has been appointed to head an interim government. In fact, she said her name was brought from the streets. What does she mean by that?
Well, in my view, she means that Sushila Karki doesn't represent any political party. Her appointment as a prime minister comes from the public, a political public. When former Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli resigned, then the president actually invited the protesters to come to the dialogue and send their representatives to the dialogue, leader to the dialogue, but also nominate their leader to form the next government. So at this stage, the changes actually happened in less than 27 hours, less than 2 days. And in a way, it was a sort of a very dramatic change. So these younger generations, the protesters actually convened a huge virtual meeting inviting more than 7,000 participants, both from within the country but also international. And there were a couple of names actually proposed as the next prime minister representing the protesters. And Sushila Karki was one of them. There was also the name of Mayor of Kathmandu, Balendra Shah, was also nominated in that virtual meeting. But eventually the protesters actually agreed to go with Sushila Karki as the prime minister of the interim government, representing the voice of the protesters. So it was actually coming from the protesters themselves. And I think this is what Prime Minister Sushila Karki might have referred to when she said her name was proposed from the streets.
So what does her, appointment represent for Nepal's political system then, especially given her non-political background?
Well, in my view, it represents a couple of things. First of all, she is coming from a non-political background, and I think this is one of the rare occasions when the interim government is being led by a non-political person nominated by the protesters outside of the political parties. But also, it also represents people's massive frustrations towards the system, towards the existing political system. People actually, through this protest, rejected the old guards, the old political parties, which have been formed within the existing political system. People were not ready to accept their leadership in the new government. So in my view, I think if I have to summarize this also kind of represents the tensions between the leaders and the political parties that have been formed by the existing system, which people see as a kind of a symbol of status quo versus new faces in the government, nominated by the people coming from a political background. And this is being sort of seen as a symbol of social change. So you can see clearly the struggle between status quo and the aspirations for social change.
Well, Karki has also promised to align policy policies with the aspirations of the young protesters and granted meritorious status to those who died. Do these moves go far enough to satisfy the protesters here, Doctor? I mean, how have they since responded to her vows?
It's very early to judge about her, response and how she is going to respond to the aspirations of the protesters. Because in the very short, protesters wanted to form an interim government, sending people to the government from outside of the political parties, and this is exactly what happened. And she is in the process of expanding the cabinet, appointing ministers from outside of the political parties. But there are all people's and protesters' aspirations also relate to long-term structural and systemic changes. For example, the parliament has been dissolved, and that's, I think, is one of the key demands of the protesters. So we have seen some signs of protesters' demand started being addressed by the government, but there are also protesters' aspirations and demand that needs long-term policy solutions. For example, addressing inequality in a country like Nepal, creating economic opportunities and addressing joblessness. So these are all the big things. In fact, there are political aspirations which are then linked to the aspirations of economic change and transformations. And addressing that would need time, but I think Karki's government is given mandate to hold fresh elections in 6 months' time, and I think the new government is working towards that. It can be said that the government has started addressing the concerns and aspirations of the protesters for now. But a lot of changes is yet to be seen, I think.
Definitely. I mean, young Nepalis have been in part frustrated by the high youth unemployment and limited opportunities fueling both the protests and migration abroad. So, Doctor, what policy changes would young people need to see in order to feel that their movement was not in vain?
I think, as I said earlier, there would have to be policy changes in the areas of both political system but also relating to the economic spheres, because political system and policies actually shape outcomes in terms of economy. In my view, the protesters want to bring about a massive shift, and they want to end nepotism. They want to end, the lack of intra-party democracy that existed amongst the existing mainstream political parties for a long time. They want to see new faces, especially from younger generations, going to, representing people in the new parliament. Even there are discussions about what could be the form of political system in the days to come, because I see there is a group of protesters who talk about directly elected prime minister rather than the current system where prime minister is elected by parliamentarians. So look, there are demands about a completely new and redesigned political system, which might take time. But at the same time, all of these changes, at the heart of all these kind of political changes, social changes that the protesters are demanding for is demanded to create a kind of equitable economic opportunities in the country, creating more jobs. So in the long run, there has to be policies that actually creates kind of favorable conditions for foreign investment, new investments, private sector investing in it, but also government working towards creating more jobs and economic opportunities for young people.
Well, Karki has also pledged to step down after 6 months, with elections scheduled for March 2026. That's less than a year away. So, Doctor, are Gen Z protesters likely to channel their energy into formal politics, such as, running as candidates now that given the current situation? What are you expecting? And do you think that this marks the beginning of a long-term generational shift in power?
I think it will be too early to comment on that, but I don't actually deny the fact that there may be new political forces emerging from among the protesters. We have seen this happen elsewhere in other countries when political system is redesigned and framed following protests of this scale. But in case of Nepal, that may be possible. Even I see a distant possibility of protesters, reorganizing, some protesters reorganizing or even reorganizing into a political institutions or political party in one way or others. Because if we really want to institutionalize this change in the long term, and if the change we want to see in line with the demand and aspirations of the protesters, then there has to be a political process that brings more and more young people in the politics, more young, innovative people coming to the politics and contributing to nation building. But then the big question here is who would take charge of that, how these young peoples are empowered, provided opportunities to articulate this voice through a very organized as an organized political force. I think that takes time. That's a long process, and it's too early to project anything along these lines. But what I would say is that we might see people from among the protesters actually over the time taking more active political roles. But at the moment, like in the interim period, protesters have clearly stated that they don't want to go to the government, they don't want to lead the government, they don't want to be in the politics. That might change over the time. And with the kind of scale of change, with the rapid pace of change we have seen the last few days, and the way young people politically conscious, expressing their political consciousness and their concerns about the future, and the way they have come to the street and actually organized themselves as a mighty force to force the government to step down. All of these things is actually pointing to young people's aspirations and intention to bring about meaningful social change in the country. We have to see.
Some great insights from you there. Thank you so much, Dr. Subedi, for joining us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you. That was Dr. D.B. Subedi, lecturer in Peace and Conflict Studies at the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.